Racist air hostess slaps a black man not knowing that he is a billionaire ending shocked everyone. David Williams was a successful black businessman in his late 30s, known for his calm demeanor and charitable work. He was used to moving through elite spaces where his presence was sometimes met with skepticism or discomfort due to his race. On this particular day, he boarded a flight from New York to Los Angeles, dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, his usual attire for business trips. As he sat by the window, he took a deep breath, appreciating the calm before what would likely be a busy trip filled with meetings. He placed his expensive briefcase under his seat, leaned back, and adjusted his noise-canceling headphones, ready to tune out the world. But his quiet journey was about to take a turn he couldn't have predicted. The flight attendants were doing their rounds, and one of them immediately caught David's attention. Her name tag read Karen Smith. She was tall, blonde, with a stiff, almost robotic smile. There was something about her demeanor that seemed off. As Karen moved up and down the aisle, greeting passengers, her interactions with certain people, especially those who looked like David, were noticeably different. Where she was warm and polite to some, she was cold and dismissive to others. David had encountered this sort of behavior countless times, so it didn't surprise him, but it did annoy him. As the flight took off, David settled into his seat. About 30 minutes in, he decided to ask for some water. He pushed the button to call for assistance, and Karen appeared, her expression hardening when she saw it was him. "What do you need?" she asked, her voice sharp and impatient. David, taken aback by her tone, kept his response calm. "Just a glass of water, please." Karen sighed loudly, clearly annoyed. "You'll have to wait until I finish serving the others." She turned on her heel without waiting for his reply and walked away. David blinked, surprised by her rudeness, but he decided not to react. He had faced worse in his life and knew better than to escalate a situation like this. However, as Karen continued to serve others, David couldn't help but notice the difference in how she treated passengers. She was cordial to the white passengers, offering them drinks and snacks with a smile, but when it came to people of color, her demeanor shifted. She barely made eye contact and rushed through their requests. It wasn't just him, he realized. This was a pattern. After another 20 minutes, Karen finally brought him the water. She placed it on his tray table with such force that some of it spilled onto his lap. "Here," she said curtly, turning to walk away. David, his patience running thin, spoke up. "Excuse me, but I think there's been a misunderstanding. I wasn't trying to rush you earlier, I was just asking for water." Karen stopped and turned to face him, her eyes narrowed. "You people always think you deserve special treatment," she said quietly, but loud enough for him to hear. The words hit David like a punch to the gut. "You people." It was a phrase he had heard too many times, one laced with prejudice and disdain. He felt a familiar surge of anger rise in his chest, but he forced it down. He had learned long ago not to let people like Karen get the best of him. David met her gaze calmly. "I don't expect special treatment, just respect. That's all." Karen rolled her eyes and muttered something under her breath before walking away. David could feel the eyes of the passengers around him, some of them watching with curiosity, others with discomfort. No one said anything. They just observed, as if this kind of treatment was normal, something to be ignored or endured. For the next hour, the tension between David and Karen simmered. She continued to serve the other passengers, but each time she walked past David, she would glance at him with barely concealed contempt. David tried to ignore her, focusing on his work, but he couldn't shake the feeling of unease that settled in the pit of his stomach. He had been through situations like this before, but it never got easier. Racism, no matter how subtle or overt, always left a scar. Then, out of nowhere, things escalated. Karen was walking down the aisle, collecting trays, when David leaned slightly into the aisle to stretch his legs. Without warning, Karen slapped his arm, startling him. "Stay in your seat," she snapped. David was stunned. He stared at her, trying to process what had just happened. The slap wasn't hard, but it was the action itself that shocked him. A flight attendant, someone who was supposed to be professional and courteous, had just slapped him. "I was just stretching my legs," David said, his voice low but steady. "I don't care," Karen replied, her face twisted in anger. "I've had enough of your attitude." David felt the heat rising in his face. His heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. He could see passengers watching them, some with wide eyes, others whispering to one another. Before he could respond, Karen leaned down, her voice dripping with venom. "People like you always cause trouble. I know your type." That was the breaking point. David stood up slowly, his tall frame towering over Karen's. "Excuse me," he said, his voice steady but firm. "I've had enough of this." The entire cabin went silent. Passengers craned their necks, waiting to see what would happen next. Karen, realizing that she had crossed a line, stepped back, but her expression remained defiant. David took a deep breath. He wasn't going to let her get away with this. But instead of shouting or losing his temper, he did something unexpected. He smiled, a small, almost imperceptible smile, and spoke quietly so that only Karen could hear. "I know your sister," he said. Karen blinked, her bravado faltering for the first time. "What are you talking about?" David's smile widened slightly. "Nancy. She works for me. She's one of my top executives, actually. You two look so much alike, I should have recognized you earlier." Karen's face went pale. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. David continued, his voice calm and measured. "Your sister is an incredible woman. She's worked tirelessly to promote diversity and inclusion at my company. It's because of her that we've implemented policies to ensure everyone, regardless of their race, is treated with respect." Karen stared at him, her eyes wide with shock. The passengers around them were still watching, but no one spoke. The tension in the air was palpable. "And here you are," David said softly, "disrespecting me because of the color of my skin. Do you think your sister would be proud of you right now?" Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Her eyes filled with tears, but she quickly blinked them away. David didn't wait for her to respond. He turned and walked back to his seat, leaving Karen standing in the aisle, her face as white as a sheet. The passengers, who had been silently watching the entire exchange, now turned their attention to Karen. Some of them murmured quietly to each other, but no one spoke directly to her. The rest of the flight passed in tense silence. Karen avoided David for the remainder of the journey, and the other flight attendants stepped in to handle his needs. David, for his part, remained calm and composed, but inside, he couldn't shake the anger and hurt that Karen's words and actions had stirred in him. When the plane finally landed, David was one of the last to disembark. As he made his way toward the exit, he saw Karen standing near the door, her eyes red and puffy. She avoided his gaze, looking down at the floor as he passed. David didn't say anything. He simply nodded at the other flight attendants and exited the plane. Outside, as he walked through the terminal, he felt a sense of relief wash over him. He had handled the situation with grace, but the experience had left a mark on him. Racism, no matter how subtle or overt, was always painful. But David knew that he couldn't let it define him. He had faced worse in his life, and he would continue to rise above it, with his head held high.